Dyarchy and its salient features and functioning. Political science. Dyarchy 1919 to 1937, a political science autopsy of a constitutional experiment in failure. Dyarchy derived from a Greek word by words die to and archy rule, was the core constitutional mechanism introduced by the Government of India Act of 1919. It was implemented in the provincial governments of British India as a purported training school for self-government. From a political science perspective, Dyarchy represents a classic case of a theoretically intriguing but practically unworkable political system designed to give the illusion of power while retaining ultimate control. Its study is crucial for understanding the structural contradictions of colonial reform and the radicalization of the Indian national movement in the 1920s. The genesis and theoretical underpinnings of the Dyarchy. The concept was not born in vacuum but was the product of a specific colonial logic aimed at managing Indian political aspiration without ceding real authority. The political foundation, the training school model. The underlying assumption articulated by the British authors of the reforms, Lord Montagu and Lord Chelmsford, was that Indians were not yet ready for full self-government, they needed a period of apprenticeship. Dyarchy was convinced as a pedagogical tool by giving Indians control over less critical departments. They would learn the arts of administration and ministerial responsibility, gradually preparing them for greater power in the future. This was a deeply paternalistic and authoritarian model, reflecting the colonial belief in the inherent superiority and necessary guardianship of the British. B. The structural blueprint. The division of subjects. The entire system rested on a fundamental division of the provincial administration into two distinct lists. The reserved subjects. These were the nation building and law and order department, considered too vital to be entrusted to Indian ministers. They included law and order, police, justice, finance, land revenue, taxation, irrigation, control over the civil services. These subjects were administered by the governor and his executive councillor, who were typically British officials. They were not responsible to the provincial legislative council and could not be voted out by it. The transferred subjects, these were the soft or development oriented department deemed suitable for Indian control. They included education, public health, local self-government, agriculture, public works. These subjects were administered by Indian ministers chosen from the elected majority in the provincial legislative council. These ministers were responsible to the legislature and command had to command its confidence to remain in power. Source integration. The theoretical rationale is laid out in the original Montagu-Chelmsford report 1918, a pre-primary document. A critical analysis of this training school logic is found in R.J. Moore's The Crisis of Indian Unity, 1917 to 1940. Second, the salient feature, the architecture of a schizophrenic state. Dyarchy design contains several key features that predetermine its dysfunction. The role of the governor, the imperial linchpin. Schizophrenic means, dualism. Power is in two hands. That's it. That's the meaning of schizophrenic state. The governor was not a constitutional head, but the absolute pivot of the entire system. He possessed overarching powers, including the power to overrule the ministers on transferred objects, power to certify legislation rejected by the legislature if he deemed it essential for the safety and tranquility of the province, the power to administer the reserved subject as he saw fit, with no input from the ministers. This made the governor an autocrat, effectively holding a veto over both halves of the government and ensuring that the wishes of the legislature could always be superseded by the imperial will. The bifurcated executive, the house divided. The provincial executive was split into two separate entities, the executive councillor for reserved subjects and the Indian minister for transferred subjects. There was no collective responsibility. The councillors and ministers did not form a unified cabinet. They often worked at cross purposes with the councillors, backed by the governor, holding the real power and financial purse strings. The financial strangulation. This was the most crippling feature. While the subjects were divided, the province finances were supposed to be a single consolidated fund. However, the reserved side controlled all major sources of revenue, land revenue, taxes, etc. The transferred subjects were funded through a fixed annual grant of this pool, which was determined by a governor and his councillors. This meant the Indian ministers were perpetually starved for funds. They had the responsibility to deliver on education and health, but lacked the financial means to do so, setting them up for certain failure and public ridicule. The functioning and reality, a system in perpetual deadlock. In practice, diarchy proved to be a chaotic and unworkable system that generated friction, frustration, and political deadlock. The artificiality of the division, the separation of subjects was logically incoherent and administratively impractical. For example, a minister for local self-government transport could not function effectively if the police reserve did not cooperate in maintaining order in municipalities. A minister for agriculture transferred found his initiative hamstrung without control over irrigation reserve and finance reserved for subsidies. This artificial division created constant turf wars and a complete lack of coordination, making incoherent provincial governance impossible. Friction and lack of cooperation. The British bureaucrats administering the reserved subjects often held the Indian ministers in contempt and actively obstructed their work. The Indian ministers representing the elected legislature were seen as interlopers by the colonial bureaucracy. This created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and non-cooperation, ensuring that the two halves of the government could not work as a team. The inevitable failure of the minister. The Indian ministers were placed in an impossible position. They were accountable to the electorate for promises they lacked the power and resources to fulfill. Their inevitable failure to deliver tangible results discredit the very idea of Indian self-rule in the eyes of many, playing into the British narrative that Indians were not yet fit to govern. Source integration. The practical failures and administrative chaos are vividly documented in the memoirs and writings of contemporary Indian ministers and politicians such as Chimanlal Setalvad Recollections and Reflections. Systematic analysis of its dysfunction is provided in Hug Tinker's Foundation of Local Self-Government in India 1884-1919, which, though focused on an earlier period, provides context for the failure of transferred subjects like local government. The nationalist response and the ultimate demise. The Indian political class was not fooled by the facade of diarchy. Their response was central to its ultimate failure and repeal. Outright rejection and non-cooperation. The Indian National Congress under Mahatma Gandhi condemned the reforms that launched the non-cooperation movement 1920-22, which included a boycott of the council established under that. It was a direct rejection of the diarchical system. Council entry and obstructivism. After the suspension of non-cooperation, a faction within the Congress led by C.R. Das and Motilal Nehru formed the Swaraj Party. They argued for contesting election and entering the councils to wreck the reforms within. Once inside, their strategy was to obstruct all government businesses, reject the budget, and demonstrate the unworkability of a system where the executive was not responsible to the legislature. This political obstruction further paralyzed the diarchical system. The official verdict of failure. The system was so universally acknowledged as a failure that the next major constitutional reform, the Government of India Act 1935, abolished diarchy in the provinces and replaced it with what was termed provincial autonomy under the Act 1935. All provincial subjects were transferred to Indian ministers responsible to the legislation, though the governor retained special powers. Source integration. The Swarajist strategy of obstruction is detailed in B.R. Nanda's, the Nehru's, Motilal, and Jawaharlal. The official British assessment that led to its abandonment is found in the National Statutory Commission, Simon Commission report of 1930. Conclusion. The legacy of a schizophrenic system. Dyarchy was a profound constitutional miscalculation. It was not a stepping stone to self government but a roadblock. Its legacy is multifaceted. A political education in colonial obstruction. It taught Indian nationalists that the British were not sincere partners in reform. The system exposed the structural mechanisms, financial control, the governor's veto, the divided executive, through which colonial power could be maintained even while appearing to share it. Radicalization of the political mainstream. By demonstrating the impossibility of achieving meaningful change through constitutional collaboration, Dyarchy pushed the Indian national movement towards more radical and mass based forms of protest, most notably the non cooperation civil disobedience movements, a negative model for constitution makers, the framers of Indian constitution, having witnessed the catastrophic failure of a dividend executive, explicitly rejected it. They established a parliamentary system with a unified council of ministers collectively responsible to the legislature, ensuring that the chaos of diarchy would not be repeated in independent India. In the final analysis, diarchy stands as a testament to the ingenuity and ultimate bankruptcy of late colonial statecraft. It was a complex machine designed to run in two opposite directions at once. Its inevitable breakdown was a critical factor in convincing India that nothing less than full Swaraj would suffice. Okay, the topic is completed. We'll meet in the next video with other topic following this.